Shabbat Shalom. Clayton Lockett was tortured to death this week. He was tortured to death in the name of American justice, in pursuance of the constitutionally authorized right of the state of Oklahoma to kill criminals who are convicted of committing heinous crimes. Something went wrong. The administration of the drug cocktail that was supposed to kill Clayton Lockett humanely malfunctioned. That term drips with sarcasm and evasion, to kill someone humanely. And so we had the bizarre spectacle of the Oklahoma executioners, unable to find a usable vein, inserted a catheter into Clayton Lockett's groin, and they went so far as to cover him with a sheet, they said, for privacy, to preserve his dignity. What a macabre set in the theater of the absurd, while inflicting the ultimate indignity, state-sponsored killing. Officials took care to cover his groin. This is what passes for dignity in some parts of the United States nowadays. We did not ourselves administer the drugs, but as Americans, we share the responsibility. We will have to repent in this generation, not only for the frontier justice of the malevolent people, but for the appalling silence of the benevolent people. Clayton Lockett was a monster. He was depraved. He shot a 19-year-old woman and buried her alive. He was a menace to society. He was cruel. He was despicable. Some believe that the only just response is measure for measure. An eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, a fracture for fracture. He who kills a human being shall be put to death. This is what the Parsha of the week specifically tells us to do. Nefesh tachat nefesh, a life for a life. In fact, the Torah is replete with descriptions of crime deserving of the death penalty, and it also describes the methods of execution. In the case of the week's Torah portion, we are instructed to execute one who blasphemes God. The method? Stoning. Capital punishment is God's will, say its defenders. It's in the Bible and mentioned over and over again. It's divine justice, according to some who describe themselves as religious. But when you look more closely at Jewish tradition, you will discover that Judaism abolished the death penalty already thousands of years ago. The sages restricted its application so tightly that the Talmud finally proclaims a court that puts a man to death once in 70 years is a destructive court. We read further that Rabbi Tarfon and Rabbi Akiva said, had we been on the high court, no one would ever be sentenced to death. Were the sages soft on crime? Did they not comprehend the power of deterrence? Did they rebel against God? Did they suddenly turn away from divine justice in favor of some effete, elite atheism? It's preposterous. What they rejected was the cruelty of capital punishment. They changed the Constitution, the Torah, in the only way they could. Not by passing an amendment, but by making the execution of capital punishment and its implementation in practice impossible. And if they changed that Constitution, which they believed was written by God, surely we can change our Constitution. We've changed it many times before. The death penalty itself isn't even in the Constitution. It was validated by the Supreme Court as constitutional in case law. The word that the sages used to describe a court that imposed the death penalty is chovlanit, destructive, or undermining. Capital punishment, according to the rabbis, actually undermines justice. It undermines God because it is the ultimate punishment. And human beings are incapable of ultimates. We are incapable of administering divine justice because we are not divine. Only God can assure ultimate and perfect justice. And I hope that monster, Clayton Lockett, receives ultimate and perfect justice, but we cannot deliver it on earth. We all know the truth about justice. It's flawed. It's flawed because we are flawed. Guilty people regularly walk free, and innocent people are regularly convicted. The most recent study estimates that 4% of inmates on death row are innocent. We are incapable of pure objectivity. We are all biased. Consider these words from Clarence Darrow to members of the jury. You need not tell me that you're not prejudiced. I know better. We're prejudiced against other people's colors, prejudiced against other men's religion, prejudiced against other people's politics, prejudiced against people's looks, prejudiced about the way they dress. We're full of prejudices. Here and there, some of us haven't any prejudice on some question, but if you look deep enough, you'll find them, and we all know it. We're so hypocritical in this country. We come down on Los Angeles Clippers owner Donald Sterling rightly because of what he said, but tolerate so casually, so peacefully, so tranquilly, and so comfortably the racist structures that still exist in this country. We all know the truth. The death penalty is imposed unevenly and disproportionately on African Americans and other minorities. It is elitist. Rich people are generally not executed. It is unfair. Good lawyers are more successful than bad lawyers in avoiding the death penalty for their clients. It's violent. Even if you cover the convict's private parts. It's vengeful. It's not pro-life. It's against life. As our sages eventually understood, capital punishment does not represent love of God. It represents the eclipse of God. It does not represent love of neighbor. It represents indifference toward neighbors. It does not represent divine justice. It constitutes flawed justice. It does not demonstrate reverence for life. It demonstrates callousness for life. We confuse the wheat from the chaff. We confuse the method of execution with the principle of state-sponsored execution. The primary question is not what is the optimal technique to kill someone. Rather, the main issue is the cruel and unusual character of the death penalty itself. No other Western country has it. Israel, too, doesn't have it, making only one exception for Adolf Eichmann, who was executed not for murder, but for genocide. The death penalty is cruel. And because it is cruel, it makes each and every one of us cruel. It coarsens us. Cruelty breeds cruelty. That's why it's our issue, too. Not only the citizens of Oklahoma. The main question is not, did Clayton Lockett deserve to die? The real issue is, did the state of Oklahoma have the right to kill him? Do we have the right to kill a convict, knowing everything we know about racism, unfairness, and human fallibility? Do we have the right to take revenge on this despicable creature in this manner? Do we have the right to inflict biblical justice, knowing that our tradition understood biblical justice to exclude the practical application of the death penalty? For us, as the sages clarified, the death penalty is not justice, it is injustice. For those in this country concerned with biblical justice, why don't we do to Clayton Lockett what the Bible calls for? Why not stone him, strangle him, burn him? These are the methods of execution that are prescribed in the Bible. Isn't a lifetime behind bars enough? Aren't we more civilized, more advanced, more humane that we must take life for life? If there was good reason, it might be palatable. If by executing him, others would be spared, if it would bring back the life of the victim, if it would make our country more tolerant, more compassionate, if there were some socially redeeming consequences, then I too might be supportive of capital punishment. But it is mostly about vengeance. Studies indicate that it doesn't even deter crime. And it is depressing that in the second decade of the 21st century, in the very bastion of liberty and justice for all, there is still such bloodlust, reminiscent of a much more savage era of human development. It is evidence of a world still driven by primitive impulses and vengeful emotions, a world waiting still to be redeemed. There's a passage in this week's Haftarah portion from the book of Ezekiel. Ve'et ami yoru ben kodesh lechol, uven tameh letahor yodium. The moral leaders should declare to the people what is sacred and what is profane, and inform them what is pure and impure. The death penalty is wrong. Jews have believed this for thousands of years. It is irreligious, unsacred, profane, and impure.